March 12, 1946, Marco Street Prison, Budapest. The air in the courtyard is heavy. A massive crowd presses against the iron fences. Photographers check their lenses. Soldiers stand with rifles at attention. The clock strikes 3:24 in the afternoon. Ferenc Szálasi appears. He is the leader of the Arrow Cross Party and the final fascist head of state in Hungary. He walks toward the gallows. It is a simple wooden beam with a single rope hanging from the center. Szálasi stops. He lifts a wooden crucifix to his lips and kisses it. A priest administers the final sacraments, but no ritual can silence the memory of the thousands killed during his reign. Their bodies were left on the banks of the Danube River. Could a man carry the weight of 70,000 deaths? At first glance, a devoted patriot, but in reality, a mass murderer. How did the most beautiful river in Europe become a Jewish cemetery? The answer lies in the final words of Szálasi. We will examine the evidence. The roots of evil began years earlier. In the 1930s, Hungary drifted toward radicalism. Szálasi did not just speak. He organized, recruited, and waited. He built a movement based on blood and soil. The footage shows thousands of men in green shirts marching through the streets of Budapest. The sound of rhythmic chanting fills the air. It was a signal to the entire nation. There was no turning back. Thus began the darkest chapter of Hungarian history. January 6, 1897. Kassa, modern-day Slovakia. Ferenc Szálasi is born into the shifting borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was a military officer of Armenian and Hungarian descent. Szálasi grew up surrounded by strict discipline, patriotic fervor, and ethnic tension. From a young age, a specific obsession took root. He spent hours redrawing regional maps. He stretched the borders of Hungary far beyond their actual limits. In his mind, an imaginary nation began to form. It was strong, pure, and imperial. Why did a Catholic upbringing lead to mass violence? It seemed the church taught compassion, but for Szálasi, faith became a weapon for exclusion. Years later, he described his education as being fed faith through his mother's milk. He took these religious dogmas and twisted them. He turned humility into intolerance and ritual into a justification for brutality. The First World War began. Szálasi did not hesitate. He joined the Austro-Hungarian army and headed for the front lines. The records show a disciplined soldier. He rose to the rank of officer. He earned the Order of the Iron Crown, 3rd class. It was one of the highest honors of the empire, but his personal glory did not match the reality in the trenches. November 11, 1918. The armistice is signed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses into ruins. For Szálasi, this was not just the end of a conflict, it was the death of an order. He viewed the empire as the only true source of Hungarian greatness. Then came the official humiliation. June 4, 1920. The Treaty of Trianon is signed. The consequences were devastating. Hungary lost 72% of its territory. This included 5 out of its 10 largest cities. The nation lost every single one of its precious metal mines. It lost all access to the sea. The numbers tell the story of a disaster. The population crashed from 20.9 million to 7.6 million. Over 3 million ethnic Hungarians were suddenly trapped behind foreign borders. In the footage of the era, the crowds are silent and mourning. For Szálasi, this was more than a diplomatic failure. It was a national mutilation. He believed this injustice required revenge by any means necessary. Events accelerated during the 1920s. Szálasi remained in the Hungarian armed forces, but his mind moved toward the fringes. 1930. He joined the League of Hungarian Life. This was a secret proto-fascist organization. It consisted of military officers, nobles, and ultranationalists. Their goal was simple: preserve a master race. They viewed Hungarians as the natural allies of the Germans. At first glance, he was just another officer, but in reality, he was an ideologue in the making. Szálasi began writing. He published a series of inflammatory pamphlets. The pages were filled with ultranationalist rhetoric and pseudoscience. His ideas were a mix of Italian fascism and German National Socialism. He added mystical elements from medieval Christianity. But Szálasi went further. He created his own specific doctrine. He called it Hungarism. The core of this ideology was a concept called asemitism. This was a term he invented. He wanted to give classic anti-Semitism an intellectual veneer. He claimed asemitism did not oppose the existence of Jews, but viewed them as incompatible with European life. He tried to turn prejudice into a legal framework. He made exclusion a state policy. The sound of printing presses signaled a new era of hate. He transformed basic bigotry into a moral foundation for the state. There was no turning back. The story of the radical officer had only just begun. March 1939. Europe was collapsing. While world leaders scrambled to prevent a total war, Ferenc Szálasi made his move. He officially registered a new political entity. It was the Arrow Cross Party. This name would soon become synonymous with mass execution and systematic terror in Hungary. The organization followed a specific blueprint. Szálasi did not invent his methods from scratch. He copied the totalitarian structures of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The party functioned less like a political group and more like a paramilitary sect. Uniforms defined their presence. Members wore dark green shirts and black boots. They adopted the Roman salute, identical to the one used in Berlin. Their ideology was a lethal mixture. It combined radical Christian mysticism with aggressive racial anti-Semitism. At the center stood the cult of the leader. Szálasi demanded absolute obedience. His goal was the creation of a greater Hungary based on ethnic purity. To achieve this, he needed a devoted following. He found it. What did the movement look like on the ground? The footage shows thousands of men marching in tight formations. They carried banners featuring the stylized cross with arrow tips. These were not mere protesters. They were soldiers waiting for a signal. The rhetoric grew sharper every day. It wasn't just political debate. It was a call to purge the nation of perceived enemies. They targeted the banks, the press, and the Jewish population. Events accelerated. The Arrow Cross began recruiting in factories and military barracks. They promised land, bread, and national pride. But behind the promises lay a darker reality. The party was preparing for a violent seizure of power. At first glance, a fringe group of radicals. But in reality, a machine built for genocide. There was no turning back. The foundation was laid. The era of the Arrow Cross had begun. 15% of the total vote, 29 seats in the parliament. On paper, it was not a majority. In reality, it was enough to legitimize a radical ideology. Szálasi was no longer a marginalized extremist. He was a national figure. The footage shows him speaking to massive crowds. The people cheer. Hungarian democracy was already fragile. Now, it opened its doors to totalitarianism. Many citizens chose to look away. At the same time, the alliance with Berlin began to pay off. Hitler provided the diplomatic weight. Hungary began reclaiming territories lost decades earlier in the Treaty of Trianon. The map changed rapidly. First, southern Slovakia, then Subcarpathian Ruthenia. Next came parts of northern Transylvania and the Bačka region seized from Yugoslavia. Hungarian soldiers marched into these lands. They raised flags. They occupied government buildings. With every kilometer reclaimed, the regime's popularity surged. But there was a price. The country was sinking into the logic of the Axis powers. There was no turning back. November 1940. The ink dried on a new document. Hungary officially became a member of the Fascist Alliance. The political shift was complete. The horrors began shortly after. The summer of 1941. Authorities began the roundups. They targeted the newly annexed Subcarpathian Ruthenia. 20,000 Jews were loaded onto trains. They were deported to Kamenets-Podolsk in Ukraine. The sound of steam engines, the sight of packed cattle cars. This was the first mass killing of the Holocaust. The victims were handed over to Nazi execution squads. The era of expansion had become an era of slaughter. Refugees, people without documents, people without protection or rights. All of them were murdered by the Einsatzgruppen. These were the Nazi mobile killing squads. They operated with one goal: total liquidation. January 1942, the tragedy repeated on Yugoslav soil. In the city of Novi Sad, the killers were not German. They were Hungarian troops. They carried out a brutal operation known as the Winter Raid. 3,000 Jews and Serbs were slaughtered. Soldiers pushed victims onto the frozen Danube River and opened fire. But resistance existed within the government. Prime Minister Miklos Kalej was a conservative and a nationalist. Despite this, he refused to hand over Hungarian Jews to German authorities. It was a calculated risk, a gesture of courage, though limited in scope. Where was Ferenc Szálasi during this time? He was behind bars. Authorities had detained him for subversive activities and plotting against the state. But prison did not break him. He waited. He remained silent. He remained a fanatic. Szálasi was convinced his hour would strike. 19 March 1944. German troops crossed the border and occupied Hungary. Adolf Hitler made the move. He feared the country would exit the war or sign a secret armistice with the Allies. The footage shows German tanks rolling through Budapest. Admiral Miklos Horthy remained as regent, but he lost his power. The Germans removed Kalej from office. Dom Stoje took his place. He was a pro-German diplomat. He legalized the Arrow Cross Party. The Hungarian government began to align perfectly with the genocide of the Third Reich. Then came the fatal blow. May 15, 1944. One of the fastest and most efficient operations of the Holocaust began. The scale was massive. In just 8 weeks, 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported. They used more than 145 trains. The destination, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Most did not survive the first 24 hours. They died in gas chambers filled with Zyklon B. Josef Mengele and Rudolf Höss oversaw the process. It was a killing machine operating with industrial precision, the sound of heavy iron doors locking, the hiss of gas. July 1944. International pressure mounted. The horrors became impossible to ignore. Horthy finally acted and ordered a suspension of the deportations, but the damage was done. Hundreds of thousands were already dead. The worst was yet to come. Ferenc Szálasi, the prophet of hate, was ready. When he reached power, Hungary would fall into the abyss. It would be a reign of terror. October 15, 1944. The national radio broadcasted a shock message. Miklos Horthy announced an armistice with the Soviet Union. It was a desperate gamble. He wanted to save Hungary from total destruction. He wanted to preserve what remained of national sovereignty. But would the Nazis allow it? In reality, the trap was already set. Hitler's response was immediate. The streets of Budapest filled with German armor. There was no turning back. Berlin received word of the secret messages sent to Adolf Hitler. The German response was immediate and brutal. They called it Operation Panzerfaust. At the head of the mission stood a name feared across Europe, Otto Skorzeny. He was the SS officer who had already rescued Mussolini from Allied hands. Now his mission was more audacious. He had to topple the head of state in Hungary. In a few hours, SS commandos invaded Budapest. The city was taken without warning and without resistance. But the most cruel blow was yet to come. Skorzeny's men kidnapped Miklos Horthy Jr. He was the son of the Hungarian regent. The soldiers rolled him into a carpet and tied it shut. They carried him out of the country like a sack of potatoes. They drove straight to the Budaörs airport. The destination was Nazi Germany. There, the son became a hostage of the Reich. The message to Horthy was clear. One day later, the government of national unity was born. It was a farce staged by the Germans, a puppet state subordinate to the Third Reich. On November 4th, Ferenc Szálasi was officially sworn in with fanatic pomp. He adopted the title of Leader of the Nation, Nemzetvezető. His cabinet consisted of 16 ministers. Half of them were members of the Arrow Cross Party. These men were not chosen for competence. They were chosen for fanaticism. Szálasi was a messianic ideologue. He dreamed of a racially pure and militarily glorious Hungary. Now, he held absolute power in his hands. It was power granted by Nazi weapons and consolidated by fear. Budapest changed. It was no longer just a capital besieged by war. It became an abyss of blood and ruins. Ferenc Szálasi was ready to lead his nation to the end, even if it meant dragging the country through the rubble. The genocide began. Soviet troops approached Budapest. Hungary descended into chaos. Szálasi made a decision that sealed the fate of tens of thousands. He ordered the remaining Jews in the capital to be confined to a walled ghetto. The area covered only 2.6 square kilometers. It was smaller than most residential neighborhoods. Nearly 70,000 people were squeezed into this tiny space. It was surrounded by barbed wire, stone walls, and arrow-cross soldiers. It was not just a ghetto, it was a trap. Conditions were subhuman. There was no basic sanitation. Food rarely arrived. The winter of 1944 became one of the harshest of the century. There was no heating. There was no adequate shelter. Children froze to death on the sidewalks. The elderly died of hunger in crowded hallways. Epidemics spread like fire. Thus began the final collapse, November 1944. The operation began in the heart of Budapest. Thousands of Jewish citizens were dragged from the ghetto and forced into a march toward the Austrian border. They moved on foot. They wore no winter coats. They carried no food. Hungarian soldiers held the rifles, not Germans. This was the Hungarian state killing its own people. The cold was absolute. Many marchers collapsed from exhaustion in the deep snow. The guards did not wait for them to stand. A shot to the back or a rifle butt to the skull ended it. The footage of the aftermath would show frozen corpses stuck to the pavement. Ferenc Szálasi, a local Christian clerk, watched the columns pass his nursing home. He saw the sick and the elderly executed on the spot. Later, searchers found the bodies of two small boys. They were still clutching their mother's frozen body. The violence peaked in January 1945. The Arrow Cross Party began a new phase of the purge. They removed 20,000 people from the ghetto over several weeks. The destination was the banks of the Danube River. There, the killings became systematic. The guards wanted to save ammunition. They developed a calculation for murder. 3 people were lined up. The soldiers used barbed wire to tie their hands together in a single row. Only 1 bullet was fired into the person in the center. As that body fell, the weight dragged the other 2 living people into the freezing water. They drowned in the current, tethered to a corpse. At first glance, it was a river. In reality, it was a mass grave. The Danube turned red. In this sector of Budapest, the water was no longer a landmark. Locals began calling it the Jewish cemetery. But the terror did not stop at the riverbanks. January 14, 1945, 11 in the morning. At the Daniel Barrow Hospital, Ferenc Szálasi stood by a window. Another massacre was about to begin. Those who could still stand were forced to their feet. Soldiers drove them toward the courtyard. They were divided into small groups and lined up. Then, the firing began. Machine gun rounds hit them in the back and the neck. Those unable to walk did not leave their rooms. They were shot in their beds. 130 people died in 2 hours. The killers did not discriminate. Children were executed while their mothers held them. The elderly were smothered under their own bedsheets. Doctors and nurses tried to shield the patients with their bodies. The soldiers shot them all. How did the regime react to the massacre? At first glance, it seemed like a chaotic atrocity, but in reality, it was a systematic cleansing. January 19th. 5 days had passed since the first slaughter. The green shirts arrived at another nursing home. An eyewitness named Szálasi recorded the events. Soldiers separated the men from the women. They marched 70 women toward Város Major Park. Most of them were over 70 years old. The orders were carried out with absolute brutality. The soldiers did not use rifles this time. They threw 3 grenades into the center of the crowd. Shrapnel tore through the group. Their clothing caught fire. The victims burned in the freezing winter air. The combination of flames and the cold finished the job. The footage from the era is silent, but the facts speak. Ferenc Szálasi never issued an order to stop the killings. He had only one concern. He worried about the international image of his regime. He looked at the diplomats from Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, and the Vatican. He feared their reports. National Police Commissioner Paul Radoxe explained the logic of the state. He did not object to the murders. He only objected to the mess. The problem was not the death of the Jews. The problem was the method. The command was clear. The bodies had to disappear. They could not be left on the streets for the world to see. This was the bureaucratization of genocide. Death was now a matter of public relations. But there was resistance. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, moved through the city. He risked his life every hour. He issued false passports and established protected houses. He ran clandestine operations to pull people from the lines of death. Wallenberg was not alone. Men like Karl Lutz, Giorgio Perlasca, and Angel Sans Briz joined the effort. A strange paradox emerged. The Szálasi regime chose to honor these fake diplomatic documents. They ignored German objections to keep up a thin veil of legitimacy. It was a race against the clock. The killers worked to hide the evidence. The diplomats worked to hide the victims. The city became a graveyard managed by accountants. The story ended in the ruins of the capital. November the 19th, 1944. This date marked the beginning of the end for Ferenc Szálasi. His fanatical beliefs followed a strict political logic. Every delusion hit a calculated strategy. But the strategy was failing. The Hungarian regime reached the point of no return. Soviet forces moved into a full-scale offensive. Romanian allies joined the push. Together, they tightened the circle around the capital. Budapest was the target. It was the political heart and the symbolic center of the nation. Now, it was a trap. The winter of 1944 arrived with ferocity. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The city was already exhausted by years of total war. Constant aerial bombings leveled entire blocks. Food supplies vanished. Fear and repression became the only laws. The stage was set for one of the longest urban battles in history. It lasted 102 days. There was no pause in the fighting. The sound of artillery fire became constant. How many people were trapped? Nearly 1 million civilians remained inside the perimeter. They had nowhere to go. There were no humanitarian corridors. No escape routes existed. No one was allowed to leave the combat zone. The footage shows empty streets and skeletal buildings. In the frame, smoke rises from the Parliament district. The camera records civilians huddled in basements without heat or water. Szálasi stayed in power while the city burned. But his control was an illusion. The Red Army continued the siege. Every hour the ring grew tighter. There was no turning back. Thus began the final collapse.